chapters of the book of Acts as we pay attention to the history and geography that is related to the closing parts of the life of Paul. At this time, though, if you would bow with me in prayer. After that prayer, we'll begin our course. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the blessings that are found in Christ. It's our hope and desire this morning that we are encouraged by this study, that our faith is strengthened, and that we learn about your king disciples who follow Jesus, and that learning helps our own understanding of your expectations for us to strengthen and to grow. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. So again, we're continuing through our examination here, kind of looking through of all the details. The goal in part for this is to really get into an understanding of the reality of the story of these disciples. That at times when we read our Bibles, when we read through the scriptures, it's very easy to take something that is far removed from where we are and who we are and go, this is like watching a mythical event. Like maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen. And so one of the benefits for us in doing a study like this is to ground these people's experiences in reality. That they existed, they walked these roads, they sat in these places, they were in these buildings. And it accomplishes us another aspect. By taking the story from the page, placing it in real life, it takes mythical figures. Oh, Paul seems so amazing. There's no way I could ever do any of the things that Paul did. I can't even begin to rise to that level. And it brings them down to an approachable person. That is, this is someone who, when he went out into the marketplace, when he went out to teach, would have been approachable by you too. It doesn't mean that we are going to do the work that Paul did. It's making Paul back into the human he always was. And that with God, all things are possible. It should shift then our appreciation of those small phrases that Paul includes in his letters about how he understands that because of his circumstances, God was then able to turn what seemed failure into greatness. What seemed to be a weakness in him became great good. And so that gives us a larger ability to connect to the story. So the closing parts of the book of Acts shift from Paul's freedom to Paul's captivity. He is now going to be imprisoned. It is a consequence of a series of events that put him in this position. And he's known it's coming. He knew some of these things were going to occur by what means? How did he know that this was, in essence, inevitable? That this journey to Rome was going to happen this way?
Oh my God.
Yeah, so he had prophetic understanding. You ever contemplate for a second what that would mean and how it might affect your behavior? How many of you, and this is probably all of us to some degree or another, are aware of the Back to the Future movies? You guys aware of those movies? If you know a lot of it, you can raise your hand higher. If you know a little bit, lower. So they always make this big thing about, well, you can't mess with history. You can't change with it. The whole story of the movies is they always change history. But then you find a few instances where that knowledge produces weird behavior in those who hold a little bit of their future in their hand. Or you see really bad versions in one of the antagonists' fifth, where he gets ruined by his ability to predict the future. But he was already ruined to begin with. Like his character is not written to be a positive example. Well, Paul knows some things are going to happen to him. He knows full well that his journey to Rome is not going to be a pleasure cruise. He knows when he is on the ship that will be shipwrecked, this is going to turn out for safety, but there's some things we have to do to ensure that safety. I don't know about you, but when I start thinking about that, that would be a very challenging context to live in, where you know that this is the outcome. And yet at the same time, you still have liberty to choose. He could walk away. He could make a choice that says, I'll abandon all you horrible people that have been hassling me on this vessel and swim off on my own. And there are stories in the Bible where people knew the outcome of events and they chose to go their own way. You're thinking about Jonah, where he knew and he's making these constant choices. There's a great counterpoint, by the way. If you think about Jonah and Paul and the ships, there's a series of connections intertextually in the story there that will really be important for you. So Paul is going to continue to go through this. My screen decided to take a vacation. It does that from time to time. Of late, the internet and the wireless connections here have been on the struggle bus. Let's see if I can make... So that's trying to do. One more try to do thing here. Not connected to the internet, it's rebelling. We're going to just turn it off again. I apologize for that. We'll send these visuals out to you by email this week. We'll catch it that way. But this means we get to use our storytelling brain a little bit. So some things to think about as we begin to kind of put this all together. Paul's return back, and by the way, if you have your Bibles, you can open it up to the back of your Bibles. Printed Bibles, there's maps there. If you got your workbook, it's lesson 39 in your workbook. The story has Paul already completing what would be his 3 missionary journeys, where he's gone out, he has planted, he has watered, God has given increase. Apollos has planted, Paul has planted, they both watered, Barnabas as well. The churches have gone through their developmental phase, probably 10 to 15 years in time frame for journeys 2 and 3 in combined context. And Paul has bounced his way back down the steps of the edge of Israel. And so now as he makes his way into Jerusalem, the second trip to Jerusalem is a lot different than the first real major introduction to Jerusalem, right? So when he goes to Jerusalem, first time, how do the disciples in the context of the Christian world receive him there?
They were very skeptical of him.
Yeah, they're not happy to see him. It's not, oh, it's so good to see you. It's been so long. It's, oh, you. I remember you. You were there with Stephen. You were there going house to house, causing harm and havoc. It's a long road he's been on, metaphorically, spiritually, but it's changed. Barnabas was the first step, and relationally, he's already had experience where they now see him differently. Internally, start thinking about this. That is exactly the journey that many of us have been on one end or the other of. There has been someone in your life who early on supported you, like Barnabas supported him. Early on, they were skeptical of you. They were afraid of you. They were nervous by your presence there. And now, they're happy to see you. Lots of things have changed between then and now for them and you. And at this point, here's the shift. The elders told Paul that some of the unbelieving Jews at this, or the believing Jews at this point, were uncertain about his teaching in these return trips. So I'm not sure what you teach. A second aspect of us kind of thinking through this is to recognize and realize it's totally okay to go to someone and say, I'm not sure what you believe. Like, I heard you just get up and teach, or I've heard about you. It's really easy to get nervous about that, especially if you have a sense of I'm experienced. I know things. Paul's an apostle, individually chosen by the Lord to serve in that capacity. And there are individuals who might have known that, who are still coming to him and go, what do you actually believe? What do you really believe concerning the law, concerning the teachings of Moses? So there's a negotiated settlement to engage, in essence, in social custom that takes place. You're going to go and continue to behave partially in ways that were socially normal for Jewish sojourners, travelers that would be coming to Jerusalem. It's very normal to go to the temple and to go offer sacrifice or to go be present in the temple space. That's slightly different than the ritual of religious presence in the temple space. And so Paul steps up and engages. So I can do that. No problem with me going to the temple space. No problem with me presenting myself to the priest for examination. Because he didn't object to it. It's totally okay if you want to continue to keep a holy day, if you want to continue to sustain your ethnic and cultural identity. So he starts the 7-day purification process. Michael, did you have something? Your hand went up a little earlier and I kind of caught it out of the corner.
Yeah, just a short comment on their interaction and who they knew Paul to be and who they were now accepting him as, and forgiving him for being there with Steve, meaning going to house and causing all that trouble. It makes things that I seem to hold against people seem kind of petty.
Yeah.
I need to learn to get over things really quickly. Paul did these terrible things to them, and they realize he's now their brother. I can hold on to some silly things sometimes.
We all do that. There's a level of, this is really super important to me because it matters. And it's requiring, if we think back or forward in our text or back in context, think about what Paul writes in Romans 13, 14, 15. It covers questions of authority and legal government. The Roman Empire was about to put their boot very heavily on Christians and Jews alike. And yet he is writing and clearly indicating a need to submit to lawful authority. And he knows what's going to happen to him too. He's writing that letter with that context in mind in advance of his trip to Rome. But also incumbent in that is the willingness for Christians to be able to sustain and maintain their personal faith at personal sacrifice to the encouragement of those who are weaker. And no matter how you play it, every time I talk to someone about that particular text in Romans 14, everybody believes they're the stronger brother. 100% of the time. Is that mathematically realistic for you to believe you're the stronger brother every time when you look at that text? But humility is not present at that moment, and we're like, well, I'm the stronger brother, so I should. Guess what? Mathematically, you are and have been, in context, the weaker brother in that passage at some point in your life, and probably even today with somebody. Somebody is encouraging you, and they've made the intellectual connections and said, you know what? We're going to go ahead and work this way. And I will sacrifice silently for their betterment. And so you just got to start thinking through that in these illustrations, connections, and details in ways that would help us maybe better appreciate and understand all that's taking place there. This then creates the rise of an event. Paul is going to go ahead for this plan to go and put himself in that temple courtyard space. So if you remember our visuals of what the temple looks like during the time of Paul and Jesus, there is, I'll give you the modern image because that's most of what we're familiar with. There's the big dome of the rock right now in the middle of it. That's about where the temple complex would be. And if you're standing at what would have been the entrance of the temple complex, where you'd have the series of gates that would go in, and look to your right, past the walls of the temple, or today you look to the right, past the main entrance to the Dome of the Rock, there is a fortress that would have been there, the Antonio Fortress that would have been up on the rise of the outside edge. That's going to become crucial to this story, where Paul is going to be in this outer courtyard area, surrounded by Romans on the outside, On the inside, it's full of only Jewish seekers. I believe that all of them have been Jewish. All of them have been purified. All of them would have been able to see the priests and be identified as Jewish males. And now, Paul is in a condition where he is going to be basically mobbed. There's going to be another mob scene, another ecclesia, calling out of angry and violently inclined groupings. Same word is used back in the context of Antioch. The same concept is present here. And they're going to say, we got to sort this out. They say one thing about you. You say another thing. But he realizes, I can't keep you here. So how strong is the Roman authority in Jerusalem at this point if the Roman soldiers say, we can't keep you here? We can't keep you safe here. They're outnumbered. They don't have a legion inside the city. They have taxing authority. So they're leeching the wealth off of the city back to the Roman Empire. And they send him with effectively 470 soldiers to keep him safety, give him safe passage. From there, out to the coast. So he's going to go from that spot out to Caesarea. And one of the big building projects of the earlier generation of leadership there, Felix is our governor. And so he listens to the testimony of Paul. He also had some knowledge about what's going on. Some of these things were relatively familiar to him. And then he ordered Paul to be treated well and provided for. Paul's friends can visit him whenever they wish. And as the text says, he listens to his message and trembled at the implications of it. Caused him to question, hey, wait a minute, maybe there's some significance there. This is where I have a little note in my Bibles over the years. It shows us the combined influence over time. And the note is, this is connected to the resurrection. Here's why. Remember, when Jesus was resurrected, how many other individuals returned from the grave, according to the follow-on texts? Was it just Jesus that rose again, or were there others? Give me a rough number. Use your brains. Don't be exact. The text is exact. 10, 20, 100, 500. What was that? 500. So one resurrection, and you could play that off as, oh, clearly this was some sort of scam. 500 individuals returning from the grave is a different kind of ability to, well, this is not something, and they're going to influence everyone afterwards. So you ask about, like, hey, what's going on here? Why is he trembling at the message? He knows something, and a large amount of some things, far more personally than we know. His ability to interact with disciples, with Christians, with people from the first century is expansive. And one more layer. This message from Jerusalem had already received this point where it is turning everything upside down. The gospel is starting to spread so substantially through the Roman Empire that on a level of literary standpoint, like letters going back and forth, they're already getting letters in the Roman government about what do we do with these people. And people that are mentioned in the biblical text in just a very few years are going to be central to trials regarding their convictions. Polycarp is a great example of that, where Polycarp is mentioned in the New Testament text. He sustains his faith under high pressure and is unwilling to relent in his faith. And so this is the gospel now moving into the governing context. So Felix is aware of this both from his family, but also from context. Paul is now kept prisoner there for 2 years. The history suggests he would have been kept in the basement prison space of the palace. So he's kept on one end of the palace where the basement prison space is. The other side of the palace has the private swimming pool of the Roman authorities. And so he is allowed to be kept there. and visited by folks, sustained by folks in advance of his eventual move from there, as politics churn forward, to a sail vessel, a trip that will take him eventually to Rome. Festus becomes governor. Festus is our next kind of cultural big picture interaction. Festus, though, is presented with a problem. He has a prisoner who has to go to Caesar. A lot of times in antiquity, around 100 to 300 AD, just as it is today, prisoners are often bargaining chips between nation states. You see today in the news, we have a prisoner release, a prisoner exchange between these two countries. Even America engages in a little bit of that at times when we try to figure out solutions to problems. Paul is a political prisoner as much as he is a prisoner because of his faith. Because he was moved out of Jerusalem because of the Jewish context. But that was no longer the issue anymore because he had appealed, legitimately so, to a larger and higher authority. It's now too late to simply let him go because the paperwork trail is there. Can't cover that part up. Problem is, though, there's no logical reason to charge him as the things that he says he's accused of. But that's a conflict in our minds, too, because is Paul a murderer by our standard? Would we call Paul someone who is a murderer? Did Paul call himself a murderer? He held the guilt close to him. And from our standards, he had broken a couple of laws, both Roman laws and Jewish laws, in regards to the punishment he brought out to those Christians. But the way the laws also worked is those Christian families would have been the ones who would have had to press for a trial. They would have had to involve themselves in the process to sue for justice. That wasn't taking place, and that wasn't the reason he was captured, and he didn't deny it. So there is a series of other things going on. Herod Agrippa now comes to pay his respects to Festus, who's the new governor. Agrippa, Jewish by his religious context. Festus decided that he'll have a better understanding of what's going on with Paul. Agrippa says, "You almost persuade me now to be a Christian." Remember the context of the time frame from around 40 or 50 BC to 100 CE or AD is you've got the whole question of the difficulties between Roman rule, Jewish royal rule, and whether or not these compromising Jews legitimately still sustain their faith. That's where Agrippa and his family is. They are the compromising Hellenized Jews. But he also knows quite a bit about Judaism. He also knows quite a bit about what's going on, too. And so his response is, "You almost persuade me." Almost, but not. A lot of times we make a lot of moralism about that and thinking like, why didn't he? Here's the practice. He didn't. For all the reasons that a person might not accept the gospel today. In his particular case, you can rationalize out what would have drawn him the other direction. Would he have still been in charge as a Christian at this point? How would the Jews who he rules look at him? How much would he stand to lose, earthly wise, by committing to Christ? It's a great illustration in the broad sense of seeing all those pieces put together. Paul then is sent on his way to Caesar. So that's to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Today, if you were to go to Caesarea, you would be able to stand on the edge of the palace and look to your right, and you could see in the water the remains of the artificial port and harbor that they had built there. It's a U-shaped artificial harbor to keep the waves down. That harbor has sunk, but you can still see the foundation of it. Then you look off to your right, and you can see the modern rebuild on some of the structures on the last wing of it that sticks out. And so that harbor then has Paul placed on a vessel. He's first going to go up to Sidon, and then he's going to incrementally island hop across the Mediterranean. There'll be a series of stops for him throughout various places, including he arrives in Acts 27 and verse 8 at Fair Haven. The city nearby is Lycia, and so you can kind of see your typical Mediterranean island port space there. It still looks very much as it probably did during the first century. Eventually, though, they're going to have what we already mentioned before, the parallel story, if you will, to Jonah's experience with his sailing time and Paul's experience with his journey to Rome. And there's the quick contrast. Did Jonah really want to go to Nineveh? No, so he got a boat to go the other direction. Did Paul really want to go to Rome? Careful how you answer, because there's two answers to the question. When you read the letter to the church at Rome and the brethren at Rome, what does Paul say about his desire to go be with them? Does he want to go see them or not? He does. How many of you wake up in the morning and go, today I really want to suffer. I want today to be the worst day it could possibly be. Like, absolutely not. We wake up and go, okay, all the parts are still there. I have the physical capacity to get out of bed. Today can be a better day than maybe it could have been. So we're thinking about positives. I kind of think of it this way. I think Paul did want to go to Rome. He wanted to go to Rome in spite of knowing what was going to happen. In spite of the challenges. He still desired to go to Rome. He still desired to go to Rome in the process. Even though he knew deeply and clearly that it was not going to be a pleasant experience. He would then go through the dialogues and experiences of being on the boat with the crew. They try to figure out what's going on. And the solutions are brought up. Well, some of the crew's like, we're out. We're dipping. We're getting in this little dinghy and we're off. We're going to make sure we're safe. And they're stopped. Paul's general statements are, look, everyone's going to be safe, but the cargo and the ship are lost. They eventually are then on the coastline, warming up. And if you want to parallel, think back to Jesus and Peter on the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus is making a meal for them when they arrive. It's a good link to put those two stories together in your head and to remember some similarities there. In the course of that story, what happens to Paul? Paul turns southern and becomes a snake handler, right? A venomous snake, a poisonous snake, jumps out of the fire and attaches to him. Everyone there on the island says, what's going to happen? He's going to die because, look, that's math, right? That kills that. Like, that's a pretty simple occasion. And they also make a value judgment about it. Because they know what's going on there because he's a prisoner. He escaped the shipwreck, but he's not escaping judgment. We don't know exactly what kind of critter that was that attached to him, because at some point from the 1st century to the 8th century, all snakes were eradicated from the island. All of them. It wasn't until around 1800 or so that dangerous snakes were reintegrated back into the society there, and I don't know how they got there. I think in history they say something about cargo or whatever. So all of the modern poisonous critters that are in there, the snakes, are not the same species that would have been there then. So there's a good 1,000 years where you could have lived on the island and been snake-free life. And so some of you were like, moving tomorrow to the snake-free world. It's very pretty. It's probably a good place to live in that time frame. But we can kind of think through and see this is God still continuing to use Paul in different ways. They see him now as something extraordinary. Because you don't get bit by a venomous snake, poisonous snake, and live. Like, that just doesn't happen. That also flips because Paul's work there expands beyond just his ability to survive that. They are realizing that he is working with God, and he has to explain to him, I'm just a man. I am not one of your gods. I am a servant. I am a messenger, but I am not to be worshipped. He catches a ship from there to Alexandria, sailed and landed at Syracuse for 3 days, and then Acts 28, verse 14, he would stay with the brethren there for 7 days, eventually making his way to Rome. At the time that Paul is there, the population of Rome, slaves and free, is about 1 million people. Now remember, majority of the Roman Empire outside of Rome are slaves. The same thing is mostly true inside of Rome. Slavery in the Roman Empire is a variety of contexts. You have those who are captive slaves. You have those who are indentured slaves, debt. You have those who are slaves because of their criminal context, and they were slaves in that regard. Paul is then seen interacting, though, predominantly in the space of the palace, given freedom, leeway. There is, in archaeological context, the palace context that he's connected to in Rome at the time had almost 1,800 governmental buildings in Rome. They were all part of the complex he would have been free to move in, all still considered part of the palace. And so his capacity, though, would have still been linked together to always have a guard. He would have never been alone, and that guard could have been one person, and often in the context of how Paul would have been imprisoned in the first century, in his place, the guard would have slept with him in the room. They would have stayed constantly rotating people all the time. And so Paul sleeps, he might be awake, he might be on, like just sitting there, eyeballing you the whole time. Making sure not only you're not harmed, but also that you don't flee. And that creates an ability for him, being Paul, to talk about, hey, why are you here? Well, because of what I believe. Because I believe in Jesus and the resurrection. There's a pretty powerful series of events that kind of show Paul increasingly take advantage to this circumstance. About 2 years of time where he's allowed to live then eventually in his own hired house. Visitors can come and go. Luke closes the account of Paul's life at this point. And so at the close of the book of Acts, we don't get to really see all the final details from the inside of the text. We know that Paul is accompanied by Luke from around Acts chapter 16-ish, perhaps, forward in different levels. Most of this book was probably written when Paul was in prison in Caesarea, and then Luke seems to be connected to the next story. If you're looking in a sense of secular history, Paul was in prison in Rome from around 61 to 63 AD. Nero was the emperor of Rome from 54 to 68 AD. And so that would have been kind of putting the context. And so when his case was heard, Nero would have heard it. Nero was the emperor leading all the way up into the events that involved the destruction of Jerusalem. That took place a few years after his reign, but it was what led up to it. He created the world context for that to be the outcome. In spite of being a prisoner, history reminds us that he was a preacher who folks would come and hear. Epaphras visits Paul from the congregation at Colossae. Paul would write a letter and send it by the hands of Tychicus and Onesimus back. They also would carry the book of Ephesians to the church at Ephesus. Colossians and Ephesians are companion messages, by the way. Colossians stresses the deity of Christ and the fullness of Christ as divinity. Ephesians stresses the church and the fullness of Christ in its relationship to God and to the kingdom. Onesimus is a criminal who Paul meets, runaway slave who had been put in prison. Paul converts him, sends him back to Philemon. Philemon was a friend of Paul's, and Paul asked him to send Philemon, or send Onesimus back. Epaphroditus brings a gift to Paul from the church at Philippi around 63 AD, continuing to be supported by what would be primarily the Gentile churches. So remember, Paul's work was really centered in Antioch of Syria, predominantly a Gentile convert church, and then most of his work was to the Gentiles as well, fulfilling God's promise to him that he would be an apostle to the Gentiles. And his support mostly came from those same contexts. Tychicus and Onesimus carried the Colossian letter and Ephesian letter back to those congregations. Onesimus carried that letter to Philemon. Epaphroditus carried the letter to the Philippians, all mentioned inclusively into the text. The Bible itself never reveals to us the details of his inevitable trial. The only evidence we have of any of his work during that time comes from 1 Timothy and Titus, because they're written in that captivity prison context. Often we refer to 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus as prison epistles for that reason. There's also evidence later that Paul worked in Ephesus, Macedonia, and Crete during the latter edges of that time. He apparently left a cloak in Troas, 2 Timothy 4, verse 13. I'm cold, bring my cloak. I'm bored, bring my books. I think we can all commiserate to that one. He told the Romans he had hoped to go to Spain someday in Romans 15 and verse 24. We don't know. There's no evidence if that was actually the outcome. In 64 AD, 1 year after the biblical record carries for him, a large portion of Rome burned. Nero applied the blame to whom? Who was the scapegoat for the burning of Rome? Christians. Now, it's a little complicated in the history as to what he's meaning by some of those contexts, but it's a marginalized group of very low power. History tells us he was cruel, he was unscrupulous. He had already engaged in the killing of Christians as a form of sport then and afterwards. Paul seems to have been arrested a second time, wrote 2 Timothy, and history says that he was beheaded rather than be sent to the arena and either be crucified or slaughtered. That's our first bell, right? All right. He faced death at a time now in order to gain the cross. Paul's last letter is also written, as it says, to his beloved son in the gospel, Timothy, in 2 Timothy chapter 1. Verse 21 in the text, it says, "Do your utmost to come to me before winter. Come see me." He writes, chapter 4, verses 6 through following, "For I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." We were going to have a pop quiz, but you're escaping that because the pop quiz is gone from up here, so you get that one off. Instead, we've got about 3 minutes or so. This is question and answer on the other end of it. Michael?
So, going back to your earlier comment, when you talked about them being real people in real places, so much of this is easy to relate to when it talks about the relationships with people and teaching and interacting with each other. But it's really hard to relate to his life. For instance, I can adjust my thermostat, I can drive in my car, and if I ride in a boat, it has a motor on it. When I think about walking to Savannah, it's a little unrealistic. When I think about taking a sailboat or worse, a merchant ship, 100 miles, those are the things in their real life to me that are the hardest to relate to.
It's a big stretch. Michael put a number of things in the box. But if we just go and say, what happens if in the middle of Georgia summer you have to go 3 weeks without air conditioning.
It's emergency.
That's a straight up emergency, right? Like we are going to be finding solutions to the problem right away.
Go back to our childhood when you do that.
For some of you, like that's like normal, you know. I don't think I owned a car with air conditioning for quite a few years growing up, but that's a different context. There's a big stretch there, but you can, even just in Georgia, go out to any one of the historical sites from one of our own historical spaces and walk and experience some of this. So if you go down to the fort / National Cemetery, just Anderson kind of space, Anderson Prison Cemetery and Fort, you can experience some of this to a degree because you can walk the grounds and get a little look at, hey, this is the physical space of some of these things. And they do a great job of presenting it. If you go to LaGrange, in LaGrange they have the Biblical History Museum, and you can see a little bit of it there. They do a great job of representing some of the events from the text of Judges and lets you see and put your hand on stuff. If you're adventurous and you want to sacrifice the cost, you can get on a plane or a boat and travel to the Middle East and make some of those walks. And yeah, they are long and they can be difficult. On the flip side though, Alan and Donna, did you wish you had done it about 25 years ago?
Yes, and we would have done it again and again. It was beautiful.
Yeah, it's very addictive. And so once you go once, you're like, I want to go back again because I missed something. And so you can really kind of re-explore it that way. So all of this stuff can be contextualized or experienced in small amounts. And if anyone wants to go on a hike and get 5 or 6 miles in, we can make that arrangement. We can all hike together and we can do like a 1 day's worth of what it would like to travel for Paul and those in the first century. Remember, that's normal for them. The stuff that we're upset about, that's all the stuff that was average for them. And to a certain degree, it's very possible that the ways that we do things now would make them uncomfortable. Just think about those who had to struggle from changing from riding horseback or in buggies and wagons and got in the first automobiles. You're going to die in that. It's way too fast. It's terrifying. You know, why you're on that thing. It's a death machine. So there's a level of that degree either way. That's it for our time. Les, who's actually in charge of the class, says it's time to stop. And so we'll continue with this next week, and hopefully the Wi-Fi won't die.